and a record the UK doesn't want. It has recorded its deadliest day after close to 1,000 people died in hospitals in the past 24 hours. It's a higher single-day figure than any experienced in Italy or Spain, but there's better news for Boris Johnson, who is out of intensive care and in good spirits. Joining me live, as he does every Saturday morning, from Euronews, reporter Trent Murray. Trent, a very good morning to you. Before we get to the Prime Minister, let's start with the last 24 hours and a record that the UK obviously wouldn't want.
Yeah, good morning, Tim. Quite right. Quite a dark day for the United Kingdom in its fight against the coronavirus. 980 people confirmed killed in the last 24 hours. And as you mentioned, that is not just a record for the UK, it's a record for any European country, even worse than Italy and Spain, which we know has just been ravaged by this disease. It now brings the total death figure here to almost 9,000. So it really shows how serious the situation is becoming for the UK as they fight against COVID-19, this massive health emergency that they're now trying to get a hand of.
There are the odd bits, the odd sprinkling of good news when we are hearing from medical practitioners and government in the UK. Can you update us there?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing is that there has been a real increase in the number of emergency and ICU beds that are now being brought online. We know that massive super hospital in central London, the NHS Nightingale, it took its first batch of coronavirus patients this week. And that hospital can hold up to 4,000 people if need be. And in a mark of just how prepared they're trying to become, the Royal Air Force was seen doing air manoeuvres with a Chinook helicopter outside yesterday. The Air Force on standby to bring in patients from regional and rural areas that might need critical care. That hospital also joins several others which are being brought online in places like Birmingham, Manchester, Cardiff, as well as Glasgow. It's part of a real joint effort to try and tackle the number of people that may die in terms of giving them ICU care. But we are also starting to see that the number of people that are getting infected may be starting to plateau somewhat, but any hopes that we were going to reach the peak this weekend like we were originally promised, they were dashed today. They said it still could be 2 or 3 weeks away before we see the peak. So on one hand, infection rate starting to slow, but on the other, of course, that death figure that we saw today is still equally startling.
What is the latest with Boris Johnson? He's obviously not behind you today.
Yeah, well, I think the whole country took a bit of a collective gasp this week when we were told that he was being moved into intensive care. It's not every day that a country's Prime Minister is sent to hospital in such a critical condition. It's been a bit of touch and go, I think, in some ways, with people waiting to see how he would turn out. Well, we know today that he has been released from ICU. He's back in the wards. He's been doing short walks, apparently, as part of his recovery, and he did thank those hospital staff that have been looking after him. His Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has stepped in and has been deputising for the Prime Minister. Of course, the UK doesn't have a formal Deputy Prime Minister role like we do in Australia, so there were some questions this week about who would step in. Dominic Raab was nicknamed the designated survivor by newspapers here, but it hasn't stopped some questions from the opposition. The newly minted Labor leader here, the opposition leader, Sir Keir Starmer, says we do need to find out just how long Boris Johnson will be out of action and what the program will be in terms of deputising for him in the longer term if need be.
The whole situation being so unprecedented, I think it's policy on the run right throughout the world. It was very interesting, and it's great to see Boris Johnson on the improve, but the rhetoric coming out of he and his government at the start of all of this, I suppose we're going to hear more about that down the track, but yeah, people have been critical of the way they first approached it.
That's right. I mean, Boris Johnson at the beginning of all of this, he said similar words to Donald Trump in that he was going to continue to shake hands with people, and that's what you do in politics. But of course, as the weeks went on, he was looking across at his counterparts in Europe, seeing what was happening there and probably getting some more advice from those civil servants working for the Science Ministry or the Health Ministry, saying, look, this is just how infectious this disease can be. Things like handshaking and that is not on. There was also some questions about the herd immunity policy. Some saying in the earlier days that there was a view that perhaps letting a small portion of the population get the disease and spread it in a controlled way may be, in the longer term, an easier way to deal with it. But those plans were then sort of thrown out the window when those full lockdown laws came into place. We heard yesterday that the best estimate for immunity across the country is some 4% of people may now be immune. But Tim, that still leaves some 63 million people vulnerable here. So the health emergency certainly continues for the British government.
Trent, you would have heard from your family here in Australia. It's going to look like a very, very different Easter. Over there where you are, having been there a lot myself, this time of year is when people like to start getting out. It's Easter time where they put a marker in and say, well, the weather's going to start getting a little bit better because it's so grim for 4 or 5 months. How are they coping?
Yeah, well, it's residential streets like the one I'm in now where I think most people are going to be spending their Easter. People, by and large, have heeded that message. They're not going out. The number of journeys on trains and the London Underground and on buses as well has really collapsed. Of course, we know there's no air traffic either. People are generally staying at home. The government, again, has launched a big marketing campaign over the weekend here, telling people to stay home and to try and join their family members online. But I mean, even just walking around London, it is just so quiet on the street. When I was walking up here, there was a woman that warned me that there were several foxes up the street because there was no people around, so the foxes were starting to take over. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was coming to do Australian breakfast TV, and for our viewers at home, foxes are probably the least of our worries. But nevertheless, it is a really different mood here. People staying at home, people not going out, connecting with loved ones, and of course that is all backed up by warnings from the police that they will be out and about issuing fines to those that do try to breach those warnings and travel to meet others.
Trent, finally, Italy and Spain, what's the latest you're hearing out of there?
Yeah, well, the Spanish Prime Minister said that they now believe that they have reached their peak and they're on the downward spiral, so there is some good news coming out of Madrid. There is a little bit of unrest, though, starting to form in particularly southern parts of Italy. They've, of course, been under lockdown for a lot longer than some other people in Europe, and they're beginning to get a little bit agitated from what we're hearing in local reporting there. France as well, we can't forget about them in all of this. President Macron is going to address the nation on Monday night. Last time he addressed the nation was several weeks ago. Actually broke the viewing records in France, some 35 million people tuning in. So we do expect him to have probably a message of extending the lockdowns. We know the Irish Prime Minister has extended them today to the beginning of May. So it seems that we still have some road ahead of us, Tim, in terms of life resuming to normal, not just here in the UK, but across Europe.
And obviously a very important weekend right around the world, but in Italy as well. We're going to cross to the Vatican City in just a tick. What are you hearing out of Italy?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, the Italian government has had some of the strictest lockdown laws across Europe. I mean, it was the hardest hit at the beginning of all of this, and they've really had people placed under lockdown for some time. I mean, what we're really hearing now is whether the government there will continue its lockdown. We were expecting a decision today. I know that the announcement was being pushed back by the Prime Minister there because they hadn't quite made a decision yet, so I'll have to quickly go and check my news wires to see whether we've got any more out of there. But as I said earlier, the Italians have been under lockdown a lot longer than the rest of us, so there is a real hope that they can try and get out of that as sooner rather than later. But with the number of infections there still existent, then it may be too early to say, Tim.
Trent, as always, thank you. Enjoy what is a very different Easter for everyone right around the world.